Number 99, hymn number 99. Okay, we're continuing in the book of Zechariah in chapter 10. If you want to go ahead and turn to your Bible, open it up to Zechariah chapter 10. We're going to kick into that chapter. The past couple chapters, kind of linking them together. When we look at this, the first part of the book was about visions and giving them hope, renewal, the return of the people coming out of captivity and trying to renew them and establishing the temple and all the covenant relationship that they had. This temple was not going to ever be the way it used to be under Solomon. And so a lot of disappointment and discouragement. There was a lot of problems with the people around the area as they came back in to reestablish all that was going on. So those visions were visions of encouragement, to get them to be encouraged to work, to serve, and to societally wise correct themselves. They didn't exactly come back with godly moral values. They still had a lot of customs that they picked up after 70 years of being under Babylonian rule. And so as we shift out of those visionary, the chapter 7 was dealing with looking at God calling them to focus in on justice and mercy and trying to get them to renew their spirit and everything. And then chapter 8, he brings up the promises of restoration and of peace. When you have somebody that has been under persecution for so long, it's hard for them to calm down and to settle in and understand, focus on God. When the times are turbulent, and we see that in our own lives, when we see a lot of things that are going on, pressuring us and causing problems, we struggle a lot with trying to stay focused on God. And he reminds them in that chapter of his jealous love, his zeal for them, and that they were so important to them, and calling them to work and quit being afraid. And I'll tell you what, that's something that we need today a lot as Christians, is that we need to quit fearing the things around us and the shortcomings that we perceive. A lot of times we look at what we have and we feel like, well, we just can't accomplish things, either whether it's personal abilities or your worthiness, whatever it might be. Too often we become fearful. And so him trying to remind them, quit being a worrywart and don't be afraid. Follow me and I'll take care of you. That's always been a common message to his people. And then in that chapter 14 through 17 verses, he says about renewing this covenant. Now, remember, it's kind of like taking two images. I don't know, sometimes they do this with photography where they'll have an image under an image. And if you look a certain way, you can only see one of those images. One of them is like an old lady or a beautiful woman. Have you ever seen that diagram? I should have brought it up. It depends on how you look at it. People will either see this beautiful woman with a bonnet and everything and go, oh, yeah. But if you look close, then some people will look at it and they'll go, oh, it's an ugly witch with a nose. And it's really bizarre. And then when somebody tells you, hey, there's an ugly witch woman looking in that picture, and then they'll shift and they can now see it. Well, that's kind of, I think, a way I'm trying to help explain many of the prophecies, is that they have that dual imagery that's there layered. Very meaningful for those who are reading it and hearing the message, but also meaningful in a long-term sense. And so that's what we find here. And this covenant was one of these. It's very fascinating because the time that they start to rebuild, Isaiah and the prophets earlier had prophesied that from the time of the building of the temple, when they laid that cornerstone, that from there 70 weeks and the Messiah would come. And now it's interesting because that 70 is 7 times 7 jubilees. And that's a very important time, because if you look at the way God had set up things, the seventh day, every seventh year was a year of jubilee. And you were to release people. Well, it was a year of release, people who were in bondage. And then 7 times 7 was a jubilee year where they celebrated that. So it's all woven in here to where, in other words, they could understand these dates. They could understand some of the imagery if they were looking for it. If you're just trying to remain faithful, just stay focused, on just like Christians. Just stay focused. The basic message is what is important. But he talks about, because the question had been posed to him, about do we maintain those feasts, those days of mourning and fasting? And in this chapter, he basically reveals God is going to take those days of mourning and fasting and turn them into days of joy. And there's starting to now, Zechariah is going to start layering out, and he did last week, we looked at it, some very specific historical things that were going to happen. And now in the fairly close future, and I say fairly, depends on what you consider how long time is, but in God's time, it's coming fairly quick. We're looking at 550 BC, and what he's speaking about, some of these events that are going to happen around 330 when Alexander the Great. And that's what we looked at last week, and looking at the judgment on these other nations around them, that what was going to happen to them, and how that they were going to go through these periods. And we know historically, we could look at it, and we looked at the actual direction and route, how Alexander the Great, and how that this nation, Greece, was brought up, and they're kind of like, who? It'd be, it wasn't a power at all. They weren't organized. It wasn't until it was a rapid succession where Alexander the Great's dad started uniting Greece, and rapidly then his dad was killed, and then Alexander the Great takes over, and it's fast, but it's very much coordinated with other prophecies. And Daniel also shows Greece, but they don't know it when Daniel writes it hundreds of years earlier, but all these prophecies are just kind of coming together. And so here in chapter 9, he describes basically the battle and the campaign of Alexander the Great coming down through the area and just wiping out those cities and those enemies. And one of the most famous one was that city of Tyre, where Tyre had always sat there on a Gulf coast. They felt like they were very secure. They had a little rampart out there where they could sit out in this island and stay safe. And Alexander the Great came in, tried to get them to surrender. They wouldn't. And he did the most audacious thing that no other military commander had ever done, is he took and he built a causeway, a road out to the middle of that island. And in the middle of that attack, he then snuck around and got some ships and destroyed, just wiped it out. Exactly the way the other prophets had pointed out too, that this destruction would happen. Well, there's another thing that happened during that time. When Alexander the Great comes through and establishes, we know that how rapid he came through. He goes all the way to Egypt. He goes all the way into really the Afghanistan, as far into starting to go into India, when his commanders and everybody's like, yeah, we're kind of done with this. We want to go home. And then mysteriously, he dies. Never left anybody as an heir. And so the whole empire, from Greece down to Egypt, all the way over to Afghanistan, the kingdom divides up into these generals' kingdoms, and that's what you find. And the two main ones that are the most important historically is the Ptolemy, which is the Egyptian region, and up into the Mediterranean that wraps up kind of through where Gaza is, and then the Seleucid. And the Seleucid was a general. These were two generals that took over. Now, what also goes on during this period is what we call the Hellenistic period. And you hear about the Hellenistic Jews and how that's basically taking the Greek culture and everybody adopting it. And that's why by the time Jesus came, the modern world was speaking Greek. Greek was the language. And so that also, though, of course, we see enables the ability of the gospel and everything to spread because of that common language. But the problem was the infiltration of that culture into Judaism. And it became so bad that they were being oppressed. And everybody, you had a bunch of the Jews that were saying, hey, we like this Greek stuff. We love their language, their culture, their Olympic games, and we like all this. And they started compromising. And so you had these called Hellenistic, or I'd say Greek cultured Jews. And then you had the Jews that were trying to remain faithful. This builds up into a conflict. Well, Epiphanes, Antiochus Epiphanes IV, is the king of that area. And he decides he can't stand Judaism. And so he tries to force himself, and he comes in and he makes it illegal for any Jewish customs, and he tries to convert. He's forbidding circumcision. He's forbidding any type of sacrifices. Then he goes around and forces them to offer sacrifices to the pagan gods. And that boils to a point where finally one priest, Maccabean, comes forward. He refuses to offer a pig. And so another Hellenistic Jew decides, well, I don't have a problem with it. And he goes forward and he's going to offer the sacrifice, and Maccabee kills him. And they kill the officers of them. And so a war breaks out. And that may be more familiar to you as the Maccabean revolt. That revolt results in about a 6-year period of warfare, guerrilla warfare. Epiphanes comes in. He tries to bring in thousands of troops, and he's not successful. And this is where we're going to read some of this as well. And that overlaps between 9 and coming into 10. Now, what is that important? Well, one, the messaging we'll see is how that he is trying to encourage them to see that he is there to take care of them and that these events are coming. Remember, Daniel had talked about those 4 kingdoms that had to come, and that last one was going to be Rome. But they're living in the period where this Greek one is going to create a lot of turmoil and a lot of conflict for the righteous Jews that were trying to remain faithful. And he's encouraging them that, look, I'm going to take care of this. And so most scholars will say that Zechariah is describing not only the invasion of the Greek culture, but also the Seleucid invasion of trying to force them to stop worshiping and becoming more Greek, and the rebellion and the war that breaks out. And in that, they become successful in obtaining some autonomy. He backs off Epiphanes, leaves them alone for a while. But the irony is in this, is that they reach out, the Maccabeans reach out to this little nation that's growing rapidly called Rome. And Rome doesn't get involved right then, but they start to develop an allegiance with Rome, which, as we know, doesn't end well for them because Rome's going to come in and end up dominating. So that's kind of the background historically when we look at this. But it is a continuation in 10 of this restoration for Judah and Israel. Now, so when you say Judah and Israel, it's like, aren't they the same? You know, sometimes you hear those. I don't know about you, but I'm like, if you stop and think about it and you go, isn't that the same? Well, no, it's not. Judah is a specific tribe. Israel is the totality of all of them. So you're going to hear the name Joseph. He's going to bring it up as if it's a personage and stuff. And so as you listen to him and when you read in the prophecy, God speaking, he's going to show this shadow of a much greater restoration than what is physically going to really happen. There has to be something more miraculous. Now, why? Joseph represented, his son was Ephraim. And so those sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, were a part of the tribes that disappeared when the Assyrians came in 722. And they never come back. They don't come back and start occupying territory. Only tribe that comes back is Judah. So if you're a Judean, and you're there and you're listening to this, you're going, wait a minute, they're all gone. They've been dispersed so far out, they can't come back. Where are they going to come from? And so they would just kind of go, okay, well, maybe there's something bigger. So that's why I bring this up. What's the difference between Judah and Israel? So when he uses these terms, God has a meaning behind it. And that's what's interesting as we look at this. So as we look at a quick outline of this, the very first call again in 1 and 2 is this idea of calling them seek the Lord. That's always got to be the priority. It's always a priority, is that we have to seek the Lord. If we want to seek the Lord, that is the only way we're going to find resolution to our problems, our ability to overcome things and accomplish. And then he brings up this idea in verse 3 about his anger toward the shepherds. Now he's talking about the leaders that are going to lead them. And it's going to have a shadow as well of not only the immediate shepherds that are going to be guiding them through these periods, but also that shadow of the shepherds that are present when the Messiah comes, and the way that the shepherds treated the leadership of this Messiah who is arriving. We saw some very powerful language in chapter 9 of that king arriving on a donkey. A lot of beautiful symbols that if we can sit now and look back and go, wow, that's exactly what he was talking about. We're going to see some more of that as well. And then 4 and 5, he talks about the restoration and the strengthening of Judah. And then this amazing gathering and redemption. And I love this word. He whistles. And he uses that type of term, kind of whistling. And it's kind of a neat imagery to me. I thought it was kind of neat. So let's jump into the verses 1 and 2, this call to seek the Lord. And this is beautiful too. This is beautiful because if you were a Jew, you would understand what he's saying. To you and I, it sounds like, the farmer's almanac. But listen to what he says. Ask rain from the Lord in the season of the spring rain, from the Lord who makes the storm clouds, and he will give them showers of rain. To everyone, the vegetation in the field. For the household gods utter nonsense, and the diviners see lies. They tell false dreams and give empty consolation. Therefore, the people wander like sheep. They are afflicted for lack of a shepherd. So if you look at the seasonal cycle in that region there, they had what they call the early rain and the late rain. That latter rain was a rain that was double important because it gave them the water required for not only the first fruit, but it set up for the second season as well. And so he's telling them, ask the Lord for that. And this is also a shadowing of something far greater, because this is what the Lord is going to bring, is that last watering, that final one where the Messiah comes, the double reward. And it shadows how important the 3 sacrifices and services that they had, the Passover, first fruits, and the Festival of Tents. All 3 of those are in the 1 month that also comes in this time frame. So there's a lot of rich imagery that he's showing in the future, but also immediate, that they can enjoy this great time. And then he compares it. Ask the Lord for this beautiful, bountiful blessing. And just remember that everywhere else that you're going to seek is useless. And by following after them, what does it do? It gives them false dreams. So how does that fit today? Well, today a lot of people are following a lot of false philosophies, a lot of false, hollow religion, things that are offering them to make them feel good. We see a lot of messages, that I watch a lot of different evangelists and stuff, and I sit there and just marvel at how it's like that feel good, everybody gets a hug, God is wonderful, he's never going to do anything bad to you, and just give him your money or whatever it might be in that messaging, without the truth of strict obedience to his word. And that makes people have this false sense of righteousness, and that's is what he's saying. Now, we won't call them idols, but in a sense they are, because they're false. They're trying to project themselves as God in the philosophies and the false teachings, and people follow them. And this is what they were doing in idols. And he says they're worthless. They're false dreams. They make you feel good, but it's not right. And so what is the causation? Then because of that is they wander. They're lost. And he holds the shepherds accountable, those who should know better. They're teaching these falsehoods and allowing those to happen. And he says it's because of a lack of a good, strong spiritual leader. And so 4 and 5 develops the idea of restoration and that strengthening of Judah. And remember, this is still kind of tying in to what he was talking about, the historical invasion of the Maccabean culture and all this, the Hellenistic stuff that's going to happen. And so he brings in this layer again, and he continues, and he says, from him shall come. So from him who? From him. It's from God. So from God, somebody's going to come. Sound kind of familiar? The Son of God. From God, the Son of God will come. And what's he going to be? The cornerstone. Does that sound familiar? The very cornerstone. That's exactly Psalms 118, 22. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Peter quotes it as well. And then he says, from that cornerstone, him the tent peg. Now the tent peg, this is an oriental place of inside an oriental type of tent that you would have, and it was a specific peg that they would hang the most important garments and things would hang upon it of honor. It's very culturally unique. So when you think of this, when I first would read this, I thought, oh, we're talking about a tent peg. You go out when you secure a tent, you hammer it in the ground, and that's not it. It's a position within this tent of honor in a place you would put your best garments on it and hang on it. And so that is also a reflection of the cornerstone, this important, prominent one that would have these beautiful garments on it as well, this honor. And from him, the battle bow. From him, every ruler, all power, all of them together. They shall be like a mighty men in battle, trampling the foe in the mud of the streets. They shall fight because the Lord is with them, and they shall put to shame the riders on horses. Now, this is, again, kind of that, trying to separate that image in which he's showing. But one aspect of this is the way that the Maccabees were going to uprise, and the rulers, the Maccabees, were going to take over, and they would be mighty and successful as well. And so now it comes back to this battle. Now, this destruction and trampling them down, and the Lord is going to be with them. So that possibly could have been that encouragement for the Maccabees, because they were priests, to look at Zechariah and see this and have no fear and stand up for what was right. And they will fight. Why? Because they know God was with them. And that's exactly their attitude was. We are right. Even though they were outnumbered, they were forbidden to have horses. They didn't have the same warfare, weaponry and such, but yet they did. They decisively destroyed them, and they did. They put them to shame. And the riders on the horses, from 1 Maccabean 3:39, I got it written down here, and it describing what the Epiphanes, Antiochus Epiphanes IV, when he sent in his army, it's written in 1 Maccabean, it says, and he sent them 40,000 men and 7,000 horsemen to go into the land of Judah and to destroy it according to the king's order. And this is really God saying, it didn't happen. It's not going to happen. And historically, the Maccabees recording it saying this is what he tried to do, and it didn't work. They were actually successfully destroyed and defeated them away. So now we come to the really, the last part that really starts to bring in as well the Messianic or the Messiah coming, the gathering and redemption of God's people. And this is where it does start to show a little bit more what I was talking about, the differentiating between Judah and Ephraim and those terms, but it's giving that stronger passion of God's desire to bring them all and restore them. He says in verse 6 and 7, I will strengthen the house of Judah. I will save the house of Joseph. So right there, if you were a Hebrew and you're listening to that, you go, they're gone. So there's something larger in that total restoration spiritually that he's talking about that's going to happen to God's people. I will bring them back because I have compassion on them, and they shall be as though I had not rejected them. For I am the Lord their God, and I will answer them. Then Ephraim, that's another one of the tribes that had disappeared, shall become like a mighty warrior, and their hearts shall be glad as with wine, and their children shall see it and be glad, and their hearts shall rejoice. As we see this picture, it's again showing the greatness that even though the Jews, the Judeans, they become called Jews, short for the tribe of Judah, had looked down on all the other tribes as being, well, they're just lost, they're forgotten, God's just punished them. No, they're still out there. They may not have come back, but they still had a lot of families that had been dispersed throughout, that Assyria had scattered. And this is the seed. This is the brilliance of God. Was it, every time we sin and God punishes us, it blows my mind at how God takes something that we have done so horrible and through God's judgment creates something beautiful. Beautiful. The greatest example is the earth. If you look at the earth prior to the flood, it was unbelievable. It was perfect. But if you go and look after the power and destructiveness of what God inflicted through judgment, and look how gorgeous some of the geographics are around this place. You know, when I go hike up in the Gila wilderness and hiking up in that canyon where there's nobody there, and you can look and see. And me and Ryan were looking around, and I said, "Look how beautiful this is." And then it dawned on me, it's all the result of judgment. Judgment that God had to bring down on us because of sin, and yet in the end result was glory, was beauty. And that's where we come back to this, where those tribes that were taken off because of their sin and scattered, they're scattered where? All around. They still have that connection. They still have the values of their forefathers. They may not be as pure, but they're like little seedlings out there, scattered by Assyria. And then you see that from the captivity of Babylon, when Judah went off and they were scattered, these little places pop up. They're called synagogues. You're familiar with that? Well, those were not in the Mosaic Law. There was nothing that organized that said, you know, you establish these. What happened was they lost their place to worship. They could not go and offer sacrifices. There's only one place to do it. But they still were righteous and wanted to come and show some reverence. So what did they do? They would come to a certain location and they would read the old law and they would read from the prophets and they would gather. And that ended up developing into these places called synagogues. Those synagogues were everywhere. Those synagogues were all the way through Asia into Greece, all over. Where did the apostles go when they took the gospel? One of the first things you see is when Paul hit town was, where would he go? He knew where to go. And a lot of those Jews that were out there were there because of the scattering in the judgment during the Babylonian and the Assyrian scattering. And then all in that area, they started coming together. And so they created this network that when the gospel was going to come, it was going to have these hot spots that it could go to. And there were people there that loved God. And he is going to use them to then bring out the gospel. And that is one of the most mind-blowing things to me, because we don't look and see the magnificent. But this is what he's bringing out right here and showing this map. And he goes even further because he is going to listen to them. He's going to answer them. They're still out there. They're still people that he cares about. He has a covenant relationship through genealogy, but he also has the heart for them because they are trying. They still tried to worship God. The Samaritans tried whenever the Jews came back and they rejected them. And so this is this network that is so amazing. God will bring them back, restore them as if he never rejected them. That's the gospel. That's going to be that reconciliation in the end. And not only them, but at the end there, he says, their children will also see it. And they will also be glad. And they will rejoice in the Lord. 8 and 9, this is where he says, I will whistle for them and gather them in. For I have redeemed them, and they shall be as many as they were before. Though I scattered them among the nations, yet in far countries they shall remember me, and with their children shall live and return. That's exactly what I just described. That is an amazing, that even though he goes, I'm going to redeem them. How did he do this? Through the blood of Christ. Through the blood of Christ, he redeemed not only all of mankind, but he also redeemed those that felt like they had been completely left out, and they're out there worshiping in the world, out in Greece and Turkey that didn't exist then, but all around. And he's going to also then show this restoration of those faithful Jews that were out there trying, and isolated and bring them in. And that was going to be a part of this great salvation. And their children shall live because of this as well. And he says, I'm going to return them to the level that they were before, and the strength and the numbers and stuff. So he says, I will bring them home from the land of Egypt and gather them from Assyria, and I will bring them to the land of Gilead and to Lebanon till there is no room for them. He shall pass through the sea of troubles. This is the Messiah. He shall pass through the sea of troubles. He will strike down the waves of sea, and all the depths of the Nile shall be dried up, and the pride of Assyria will be laid low. The pride of Assyria will be laid low, and the scepter of Egypt shall depart. And now think about who these are. Who is Egypt? Well, to the Hebrews, the Egypt was the oppressor that Moses conquered. Where did they go through? They went right through the Red Sea. They come through. So the power of Egypt to the Hebrew would have that link to Egypt. He's going to take them away, call them out. Assyria was the one that took out Ephraim and Joseph's descendants, the 10 northern tribes. And so he's showing how all that's going to be laid low and how he's going to bring them back and reunite them in this strength. And then the final, he says, I will make them strong in the Lord. This is God, Jesus, through Christ. They shall walk in his name, declares the Lord. So that's chapter 10. Even though it's so short, the way that they connect together have such an amazing imagery and prophecies that even for us today, we can look at. And to me, every time I study these minor prophets, I just marvel. I just amazed at how beautiful and complex and how much God has done for us. And that we on this day can look back and enjoy the amazing things God has accomplished, and he's revealed it to us. And like I said in my morning lessons, talking about that mystery, now you and I can look at these and understand them. So that's Zechariah chapter 10. Next week, we'll jump over into 11 and keep going. It's a great little book. I hope that you'd read those. If you're here with us this evening and we can help you in your relationship with Jesus, and through him, we know that we can establish the perfect relationship with our Heavenly Father. If you need to become a Christian or there's something that we can do for you, I hope that as we're singing this invitation song, that you really open up your heart, humble yourself, and think about what you need to do spiritually to either establish that relationship or to encourage it. And if you need the prayers of the church, we're here as well to pray with you for any problems or struggles you're having. So think about these things while we stand and sing.